The courtroom was eerily quiet as Samuel Hayes, an elderly man with deeply weathered skin and trembling hands, shuffled in shackles. His eyes were downcast, a man who had lived through decades of sacrifice only to end up forgotten by the world. The judge, a stern woman in her mid-40s, looked up at him without emotion as the clerk asked, "Name?" His voice cracked as he responded, "Samuel Hayes, former sergeant, United States Army." There was no reaction. No one cared about the name he spoke. No one knew the story behind those words. He was just another forgotten soul dragged into the system, a relic of a past few cared to remember. His clothes were ill-fitting, a mismatched ensemble donated from a shelter. His once proud uniform was gone, replaced by the harsh reality of a man who had spent too many winters on the streets, too many nights in cold alleyways. The prosecutor, a young man in a perfectly tailored suit, read off the charges in a voice so detached it almost felt rehearsed. Disturbance of peace, loitering, refusing to vacate the premises. His words echoed through the courtroom like a judgment no one could escape. Samuel had been spotted behind the small cafe again, sitting next to a dumpster, looking for warmth. But he hadn't asked for money, hadn't caused trouble. He'd only been trying to survive another freezing night in a world that no longer cared for the likes of him. As the prosecutor spoke, the memories of his time in Vietnam resurfaced. The scorching heat of battle, the bloodied hands, the men he had fought to protect. His heart ached with a silent yearning for a time when he was someone important, when his actions meant something. But now he was just a man trying to stay warm. And that, in this court, was apparently a crime. Samuel Hayes had been many things in his life: a soldier, a husband, a brother, and a son. But today he sat alone in a courtroom, shackled and weathered, a man who had given everything for his country, yet now found himself abandoned by the very system he once served. The harsh fluorescent lights above seemed to mock him as they illuminated his disheveled figure. He could feel their cold gaze just as he had felt the cold of the streets for the past several years. His hands trembled as they rested on his lap, calloused from years of hard labor. But nothing could have prepared him for the humiliation that was about to unfold. His life, once full of purpose and valor, had unraveled in ways he never expected. Years ago, he had been an Army sergeant in the field, fighting in dangerous, life-threatening situations, standing shoulder to shoulder with his comrades. The battlefield had been his home. The adrenaline, the discipline, the camaraderie. It had all defined him. But after his service ended, everything changed. The world he had fought for didn't seem to want him back. He had no job, no family to lean on, and no real place to call home. All he had left was his military pension, which barely covered the bare minimum of his needs, and the fading memories of a time when he had mattered. The cold, unfeeling walls of the courtroom reflected that same disconnect. As the prosecutor, a young man with a sharp suit and a rehearsed smile, listed the charges against him: disturbance of peace, loitering, and refusal to vacate premises, Samuel could only sit in silence, the weight of the words hanging over him like a sentence already passed. He had been caught behind the Jefferson Street Cafe, as he often was on cold winter nights, seeking warmth by the vent in the back of the building. He hadn't asked for money. He hadn't caused trouble. He simply wanted to escape the freezing temperatures that had turned his bones to ice. But to the world, he was nothing more than a nuisance, a shadow drifting in the night. He had been here before. The courtrooms, the system, the endless bureaucratic hoops that did nothing to help him and everything to break him further. His heart ached as he thought about the years of struggle, of living with the scars of war that no one could see, the trauma that still haunted his dreams, and the friends he had lost in battle. They had all come home in boxes, or not at all. They had given everything for their country, and yet here he was, sitting in a courtroom with nothing more than the remnants of his dignity. His military uniform, once crisp and perfect, was long gone, replaced by ragged, mismatched clothes he had scrounged together from shelters. His old boots, once polished with pride, were now worn thin. The prosecutor's voice interrupted his thoughts. "Mr. Hayes has been found behind the cafe on several occasions, disrupting the peace of the neighborhood. This is his third citation this year alone. We recommend community service and a 30-day no trespassing order for the business district. The words hit Samuel harder than any bullet ever had. No trespassing meant no shelter. No meals. Just the bitter cold of winter and the suffocating loneliness of a man who had been discarded. But as the prosecutor continued, Samuel's mind drifted back to a time when he had been more than a nameless face. Back to the heat of battle, when he had fought not just for his country, but for the men beside him. In the heart of Iraq during the Gulf War, Samuel had been part of a mission that turned the tide of an entire conflict. His unit had been ambushed in a narrow alley, trapped with no escape route. His best friend, Lieutenant Robert King, had been injured in the initial attack, pinned down by enemy fire. Samuel had never hesitated. Without thinking, he had dashed across open ground, bullets whizzing past him, to drag Robert to safety. His heart still pounded in his chest just thinking about it, the same way it had when he had watched his fellow soldiers get shot, their screams echoing through his mind. But now that same man who had once put everything on the line for his brothers in arms was here, being treated like a criminal for simply trying to survive. It felt as though his life had come full circle in the most painful way possible. The court proceedings continued, but Samuel felt disconnected from the reality around him. His mind raced back to those moments in the desert, to the heat, the dust, and the sounds of gunfire. That was the man he had been, a man who faced death every day and didn't flinch. And now he was just a man with no home, no family, no future. His thoughts were interrupted by a voice, the judge, a stern woman with dark eyes, asking him if he had legal representation. Samuel looked up, bewildered. He hadn't expected to have a lawyer today. He didn't have the money for one. But before he could respond, the courtroom doors opened, and a man in a crisp suit walked in. He placed a leather briefcase on the table and addressed the judge. "Your Honor, Alexander Rossi for the defendant." The room fell silent as the man made his way toward the table, his confident stride a stark contrast to Samuel's own defeated posture. Samuel's heart skipped a beat. He didn't know who this man was, but his sudden appearance felt like a sign. For the first time in years, someone was willing to fight for him. As the proceedings continued, Samuel was given a chance to speak. He stood slowly, his body aching, but with a newfound sense of determination. "I'm not here to make excuses," he said, his voice rough from years of neglect. "I've spent my life fighting for something greater than myself, and now I'm just trying to survive." The words hung in the air, a simple truth that no one in the courtroom seemed ready to hear. But something had shifted in the room. The prosecutor's words no longer seemed as cutting. The judge's gaze softened for just a moment, and somewhere, deep within, Samuel found the strength to stand tall again, even in the face of everything he had lost. It was the first step in what would become the most unexpected turn of his life. A turn that would restore his honor and remind him that even in the deepest shadows, a glimmer of light could still be found. The courtroom had taken on a quiet weight, as if every person inside could feel the storm of emotions swirling around Samuel Hayes. His eyes were fixed on the floor, avoiding the gazes of the people who had, until now, refused to even acknowledge his existence. The lawyer, Alexander Rossi, sat beside him, his presence almost surreal. Samuel couldn't understand why this man had shown up. He wasn't even sure if he should be grateful or suspicious. He had no money. No one had informed him of this last-minute representation. Yet here he was, sitting in the courtroom like some sort of last-minute miracle. The judge, a sharp-eyed woman who had remained almost entirely unreadable throughout the proceedings, glanced up from her papers, her gaze briefly flickering toward the door where the courtroom had gone silent upon Rossi's entrance. Her lips tightened, and then she leaned forward, her fingers pressing down on the table as she gave the prosecutor a long, pointed look. Samuel saw the tension in her posture. Something had shifted in the air, but he couldn't grasp what it was. "Your Honor," Rossi's voice cut through the silence, his tone smooth, confident. "We would like to request a recess. I need a moment to confer with my client." "Recess granted," the judge replied without hesitation. She rose and the room buzzed with hushed voices as the people shuffled out of the courtroom, leaving Samuel alone with his thoughts. As soon as they were alone, Rossi leaned in toward Samuel, his expression turning from professional to one of quiet concern. "Mr. Hayes," he began, his voice low, "I'm here to help. You don't have to worry about the legal fees. We're doing this pro bono." Samuel blinked, his brow furrowing. "Pro bono? Who would help a guy like me?" he muttered under his breath, his voice thick with the disbelief he had carried for years. Rossi paused, watching him, as if considering whether to say more. But Samuel wasn't in the mood for pleasantries. He couldn't understand why anyone would want to help someone like him. A man who had been cast aside by the world after serving in a war, who had lost everything but his memories of a time when he had a purpose. The days of standing tall in a uniform had long passed. All that was left was his struggle to survive in a world that didn't care about people like him. "Let me explain," Rossi continued, his voice gentle but firm. "There's more to your case than just trespassing. Much more. I can see you've been fighting a battle for a long time, Samuel, and I think it's time we started fighting for you." Samuel's gaze drifted toward the window, where the winter wind howled, rattling the courtroom's old panes. The cold air outside was nothing compared to the chill that had settled in his chest ever since he'd been discharged. He could still hear the distant echoes of gunfire in his mind, feel the weight of the rifle in his hands as he fought to stay alive. Not for himself, but for the men beside him. Samuel had joined the army right out of high school, driven by a sense of duty, by a desire to serve something greater than himself. He had gone to war and returned home a hero. At least that's what the media had called him, a hero. But once he left the battlefield, there was no ticker tape parade, no homecoming celebration, no job waiting for him when he returned. And with the passage of time, he had become invisible. To the world, Samuel was no longer a hero. He was just another homeless man, abandoned by the same government that had sent him to war. Rossi's voice brought him back to the present. "You didn't deserve any of this. No one deserves to be forgotten after serving this country, especially not someone like you." At the mention of his service, Samuel's mind flashed back to his days in Iraq. He remembered the dust and heat, the adrenaline rush of combat, and most of all, the brotherhood, the bonds that had been formed in those terrifying moments. Samuel had never fought for medals, never fought for recognition. But in the end, he had earned both: the Silver Star, the Purple Heart, and the respect of his comrades. Yet none of that had mattered when the war was over. The battles he had fought on foreign soil had stayed with him, but in his hometown, he was just a man who had outlived his usefulness. Rossi continued, his voice growing more impassioned. "The prosecutor may want to label you a criminal, but I see a man who is simply trying to survive, doing what he needs to do. There is no justice in punishing someone like you." Samuel's chest tightened. Was it possible? Could someone actually see him for who he was, not for what he had become? A part of him wanted to believe it, but the scars of the past were too deep. He had learned long ago not to trust anyone, especially not a stranger who appeared out of nowhere to offer him a lifeline. "Do you know why you're really here?" Rossi asked, his voice now soft. "You're not just a homeless man trying to stay warm. You're someone who's been ignored for far too long, someone who's been fighting for recognition, for dignity, all this time. The world may have turned its back on you, but we won't." Samuel's heart clenched as the words sank in. He had been fighting for years, not just to survive, but for the recognition that had been denied him, the recognition he had earned on the battlefield, the recognition that had been taken from him when he returned home. The door opened and the judge returned, her expression unreadable. She glanced at the prosecutor, who stood ready to speak, but then she turned her gaze to Samuel, her eyes softening for just a moment before her professional mask returned. "I've reviewed the evidence," she said, her voice steady, "and I have a few questions for the defendant." The room fell silent as Samuel stood up, his knees stiff, his body aching with the weight of years. This was it, the moment he had waited for, not just a chance to clear his name, but a chance to restore his dignity. "Mr. Hayes," Judge Parker began, "I understand you served in Iraq. Is that correct?" Samuel's voice was hoarse but firm. "Yes, Your Honor. I served with the 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines." He stood taller, the old Marine within him resurfacing. "And I did my duty. I did what was necessary." The judge nodded, her gaze lingering on him for a moment longer than necessary. I have reason to believe that your actions during that time might hold more weight than you realize. We'll get to that in a moment. But first, I want to know one thing, Mr. Hayes. What happened to you? Samuel swallowed hard. His voice, once lost in the cold winds of his past, now had a chance to be heard. The story of a man who had given everything and lost it all. The journey of a forgotten soldier, a hero who had never asked for anything, but who now, finally, might get what he deserved. The moment the recess ended, Samuel Hayes felt a shift in the courtroom. The weight of every passing second had seemed to bear down on him more heavily than ever before. It wasn't just the usual tension of waiting for the next move in a court case. No, this was something different. There was a palpable sense of anticipation in the air. Samuel couldn't explain it, but he could feel it in his bones. Something was changing. As Judge Olivia Parker returned to her seat, she didn't say a word at first. She simply looked at Samuel, then at Rossi, her eyes sharp, but there was something else there now. Something softer, more human. It was as though in those few minutes behind the closed doors, a transformation had occurred. And just as he had felt himself begin to shift during the last few minutes of the previous proceedings, he felt it now. He was no longer just a man sitting on trial. For the first time in years, he was being seen. Rossi stood and addressed the court with the same calm confidence he had shown earlier. Your Honor, we request the dismissal of all charges against Mr. Hayes. We believe the defendant was simply seeking shelter from the dangerously cold conditions, something that no human being should be punished for. Samuel's heart beat louder now, his palms suddenly sweaty. He was used to the sounds of battle, the chaos, the explosions. But the silence that had followed Rossi's statement was more deafening than anything he had ever known. He hadn't expected this, didn't dare allow himself to hope for it. A dismissal for a trespassing charge, for something as simple as trying to survive. His thoughts were a tangle of disbelief, but there was also something else stirring within him. A faint pulse of hope, long buried and nearly forgotten. The prosecutor, however, wasn't ready to let go so easily. Objection, Your Honor. While we may sympathize with the defendant's circumstances, the law is the law. Mr. Hayes has a history of loitering, and we cannot ignore that, the prosecutor said, his tone slick with indifference, as though his words were merely a formality. But Samuel was no longer listening to him. Instead, his gaze drifted back to Judge Parker, watching her as her eyes narrowed, her expression contemplative. A moment of silence followed, and then something unexpected happened. Mr. Hayes, she began, her voice steady but carrying a weight that none in the room could ignore. I'm not here to simply apply the law. I'm here to ensure justice is served. And justice, Mr. Hayes, is something that's been denied to you for far too long. The words seemed to hang in the air for a heartbeat before she continued. I've reviewed your military record, Mr. Hayes, and I have a few questions for you. Samuel's breath caught in his throat. His military record. His heart raced as the memories of his time in Iraq flashed through his mind. He hadn't thought about his service in years. Not in this way. Not in this courtroom. He had long buried the part of himself that had worn that uniform with pride. But now as the judge spoke, it seemed that part of him was being resurrected. You served in Iraq in 2004, correct? Judge Parker's eyes met his, unblinking. Your unit was involved in a particularly dangerous operation. Am I right? Samuel nodded, his throat tightening. He could feel the weight of the memories creeping back, the heat of the desert, the sound of gunfire, the feeling of the sand under his boots, the lives that had been in his hands and the ones he couldn't save. Yes, Your Honor. I was with the 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines. We were escorting a convoy outside Fallujah when we came under heavy fire. I did what I had to do. His voice faltered as the words left his lips, but he couldn't stop them. He had always been the strong one, the silent one who never needed anyone's approval. But now here, in front of these strangers, his vulnerability was exposed. And during that operation, Judge Parker continued, her voice steady, did you, as I've read in the reports, rescue a lieutenant, a man named Jack Parker? Samuel's chest tightened. He had tried so hard to forget. The image of Jack, bloodied and barely conscious, haunted him still. He had done everything he could to save him. And now, all these years later, that same name echoed in the courtroom, pulling him back to that place. "Yes, Your Honor," he whispered. "Lieutenant Jack Parker. He was wounded. I carried him to safety, but I never knew if he made it. I heard later that he did, but..." His voice trailed off, as if saying the words aloud made the wound more real. The ache in his chest returned. Judge Parker's expression softened, but she didn't look away. She had her answer, but she wanted him to speak more. "And you knew that your actions that day saved many lives. You knew that your sacrifice was more than just a duty." Samuel swallowed hard. His heart was racing now, the memories flooding him. "I didn't do it for recognition," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I did it because that's what we do. We don't leave anyone behind." He paused, then added quietly, "Not even if it means losing everything." The courtroom was quiet, the tension almost unbearable. But then a voice from the back of the room cut through the stillness. "That's him!" the silver-haired Marine called out, his voice cracked with emotion. "That's the one. That's Staff Sergeant Hayes. He saved us all." The room fell into stunned silence. Samuel felt his body stiffen at the sound of the voice. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected any of it. But as the faces in the courtroom turned toward him, faces filled with a mix of awe and respect, something inside him shifted. For the first time in years, he was not invisible. The silver-haired Marine rose to his feet, saluting Samuel. "He saved all of us. We owe him our lives." Samuel's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't been forgotten after all. Judge Parker looked at Samuel with newfound recognition, the weight of her next words pressing heavily on her heart. "Mr. Hayes," she said softly, "you've been carrying this burden alone for far too long, but today we recognize what you've done. We honor your sacrifice." For the first time in years, Samuel felt a flood of warmth rise within him. A warmth not from the cold of winter, but from something deeper. Something he had lost along the way, but now finally was being returned to him. As the courtroom slowly came to life again, there was a palpable shift. The once cold and impersonal atmosphere had transformed into something almost reverent. Samuel Hayes, the elderly man who had been nothing more than a nameless figure just hours earlier, now stood at the center of a silent storm, one that had gathered strength not from the prosecutor's objections, but from the realization that his past had not been forgotten after all. Judge Olivia Parker's words still echoed in Samuel's mind. The recognition of his service, the acknowledgement of his sacrifice, had sent ripples of shock through the courtroom, leaving him feeling as though his entire life had suddenly been laid bare. He had expected punishment, more years of cold isolation, but instead he found something he had not dared hope for: recognition. The courtroom buzzed with voices, but Samuel remained frozen, his eyes trained on the judge who had somehow uncovered the truth buried deep within him. He could feel his heart beating faster, a mix of disbelief and relief threatening to overwhelm him. He was being seen, not just as a man guilty of trespassing, but as a man who had fought for his country, a man whose life had been shaped by honor and sacrifice. As the silence stretched on, Samuel was aware of the eyes of the other people in the room, the eyes of his fellow soldiers who had stood in the gallery and recognized him. The silver-haired Marine who had stood up in the back, the one who had called out his name in a voice filled with admiration, was now seated, still staring at him as though he too couldn't believe what was happening. But Samuel's attention was on Judge Parker, whose face was no longer the impassive mask of a judge, but one of compassion and empathy. She had seen him for who he truly was, not just as a homeless man, but as a man who had carried the weight of the battlefield with him all these years. "Mr. Hayes," Judge Parker began, her voice now softer, carrying the weight of the moment, "it's clear that you've been carrying the burden of your past alone for far too long, and it's also clear that you're not just a defendant in this case. You are a man who deserves respect, who deserves recognition for your actions. Actions that have been forgotten by so many, but not by those who mattered most." Samuel's breath caught in his throat. He had been forgotten. He had been pushed aside. And in the darkness of his mind, he had wondered if he would ever be remembered for anything other than his failures, his time in the streets. But now here, In this cold courtroom, he was hearing the words he never expected to hear. Words that for a brief moment made him feel whole again. Judge Parker's voice was steady, yet there was an undeniable tremor in it as she continued. You saved lives, Mr. Hayes. You risked your own life to ensure others made it home. And the people in this courtroom, they recognize that now. Samuel's chest tightened. He didn't know how to respond, how to process the weight of her words. I didn't do it for recognition, he said quietly, his voice rough. I just did what I had to do. And that's why you deserve recognition now, she replied gently. Because you did it without expectation. You did it because you believed in something greater than yourself. She paused, her gaze locked with his. And now, Mr. Hayes, I'm going to do something I've never done before in my career. Samuel felt his heart skip a beat. He wasn't sure what she meant, but something in the air seemed to have changed, the heaviness in the room lifting just a little. I'm going to dismiss all charges against you, Judge Parker announced, her voice ringing out clearly. Not just because of the circumstances of this case, but because you deserve more than this. You deserve the chance to rebuild your life. You deserve to be treated with the respect you've earned. The words hit Samuel like a wave, crashing over him, and for a moment he couldn't breathe. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. He had been dismissed, cast aside by everyone for so long that the idea of being given a second chance felt impossible. His heart pounded in his chest, the emotions he had buried for years threatening to spill over. In the back of the courtroom, the silver-haired Marine stood again, this time with others beside him, their hands snapping into salutes. Samuel's eyes widened, the weight of their gesture hitting him harder than anything else. These were men who had fought with him, men who knew the sacrifices he had made, and they were giving him the respect he had longed for. The prosecutor stood as well, visibly caught off guard, his face a mixture of surprise and something else, perhaps guilt. But Samuel didn't care about him. He didn't care about anything except the fact that, for the first time in years, someone had seen him for who he truly was. Mr. Hayes, Judge Parker continued, I know this won't undo the years you've spent struggling, but I hope it's a start. I hope it's a beginning of something better. With those words, something broke inside Samuel. A sob he hadn't expected to hear escaped his throat, and he lowered his head, overwhelmed. He had no words, only the raw emotion of someone who had spent far too long hiding his pain, afraid that if anyone saw it, they would turn away. But here, in this courtroom, the truth had been laid bare, and no one had turned away. They had stood with him, and they had recognized him, a man who had fought for his country, a man who had given everything, and a man who deserved more than to be forgotten. As the proceedings concluded, Samuel was handed his release papers, the charges dismissed. But it wasn't just the legal battle he had won today. It was his dignity. It was the honor that had been stripped from him and was now finally being returned. As he walked out of the courtroom, the cold outside no longer seemed quite so harsh. There was a glimmer of warmth, a light that had been reignited inside him, and for the first time in years, Samuel Hayes knew that he was not alone. As he left, he looked back at Judge Parker, her eyes still following him, her expression filled with something he could only call gratitude. It was a gratitude he had never expected to feel, but one he now understood. Because in that courtroom, Samuel Hayes had been given more than freedom. He had been given a second chance. As Samuel Hayes walked out of the courtroom, the world outside seemed almost unreal. The cold wind stung his face, but for the first time in years, he didn't feel the biting isolation he'd grown so accustomed to. His shoulders, once hunched from the weight of his struggles, now stood a little straighter. The recognition he had received wasn't just from the judge or his lawyer, but from the men who had stood with him in the war. The men who had never forgotten what he had done. The silence in the courtroom had been broken by the sounds of respect. The salutes, the acknowledgement of his sacrifice. It was more than he had ever imagined. For so long, Samuel had believed that his actions had been forgotten, that his sacrifices had meant nothing. But now, standing in the cold light of day, he realized that his story was far from over. The weight that had been on his heart for so many years began to lift, piece by piece. He wasn't just a forgotten soldier anymore. He had been seen, heard, and remembered. And as he took that first step into the world, he felt for the first time in a long while that he had a future worth fighting for. The lesson: never let your worth be defined by others. Samuel Hayes's journey is a powerful reminder that our worth is not determined by how the world chooses to see us. For years, Samuel was treated as invisible, cast aside and forgotten. Despite the sacrifices he made, the life he gave to his country, he was left to struggle in the shadows, dismissed by society. But one moment, one instance of recognition, was enough to change everything. The true lesson here is about resilience. It's about holding on to your dignity, even when the world tells you it doesn't matter. Samuel didn't let the years of hardship or the judgments of others define who he was. He carried on, even when no one seemed to notice. And in the end, it was his persistence, his quiet strength, that made others see the truth. Never let the world's neglect or ignorance convince you that you don't matter. Like Samuel, you have value, a value that isn't dependent on others' recognition, but on the integrity and courage you carry within. Everyone deserves to be seen, respected, and heard. So stand tall even when the world looks away. Your worth is unshakable.